200 cycles. That was the safety window Varric Stonehall had signed off on, the minimum structural integrity needed to weld the new stabilization pylon onto the Krellin Fusion Array's primary housing. The official Human Interstellar Directorate mandate, signed in polished arrogance by Commander Rourke 72 hours earlier, demanded the lock be secured in 48. Varric hadn't been surprised when the stress meter in his optical display flashed solid red, warning of imminent crystalline fracture. He only regretted that he hadn't taken the time to write his dissenting report in triplicate before sealing his helmet. The pressure spike hit the containment field not like an explosion, but like the sickening thump of a hydraulic press striking soft flesh. Varric, suspended 40 meters above the corroded access catwalk, felt the impact travel up the magnetic clamps anchoring him to the pylon. His teeth snapped shut, tasting bile and the high G vibration that rattled his spinal column. The atmosphere scrubber in his suit choked, filling his olfactory filters with the sharp, acidic smell of plastic violently scorched by a surge of high voltage, the signature of electrical systems pushed far past their operational limits. "Status, Stonehall." The voice of Sergeant Rowan Ash crackled in his ear, tight and sharp, layered over the screaming siren of the localized failure warning. "Tell me you have a lock. We're losing the 47 shunt junction. The Krellin grid is spiking. Negative Ash." The kinetic torque shear exceeded structural capacity by 3,000 kilonewtons. Varric grunted, fighting the inertial drag as the pylon whipped slightly under the systemic recoil. His left shoulder socket felt like ground glass. It wasn't the weld, Rowan. It was the housing itself. 80 cycles of static decay, and we tried to treat it like fresh synth steel. You told Rourke the metallurgy wouldn't hold the acceleration forces required for Eclipse Haven's power draw. A heavy silence followed, thick with professional frustration. Varric knew Ash hadn't told Rourke anything Rourke hadn't asked. Political timelines rarely considered the tensile strength of 300-year-old alien alloys. "I'm initiating a soft shutdown on the housing circuit," Ash finally said, the urgency replaced by grim institutional necessity. "You have 60 seconds to disengage before the automated response isolates the grid and triggers containment seal. If that seal fails, we're dealing with kinetic discharge at 2000 degrees Kelvin." 60 seconds. Roger that. Varric didn't waste breath pointing out that if the containment seal was reliable, they wouldn't be up here risking their lives on a political timeline. He worked the manual override on his magnetic clamps, his gloved fingers slipping on the oily, wet surface of the aging metal. This platform, Verlasung 3, stank of industrial fatigue, old grease, metal superheated, and the distinct, cold smell of recycled air saturated with 4 generations of biological waste. It was a world rotting from the inside out, and the Directorate was trying to paint a fresh coat of protection on the outside. He finally freed the first clamp, the clank, echoing hollowly in the vast space of the generator room. Below him, dimly visible through the hazy atmosphere, a delegation of Krellin citizens, tall, thin, with robes the color of oxidized bronze, were watching the human activity. Not with gratitude, but with the weary, profound suspicion of subjects who know they are about to be leveraged. Their elder, Zoraz, had been right. Protection means claim, and claims always demand sacrifices from the claimed. Varric swung his body across the ruptured seam of the housing, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done high-risk maintenance in 15 different low-gravity failure zones. The immediate danger was past, but the throbbing ache in his shoulder was a physical manifestation of the insult. They had been reckless with his life to save 30 hours on Rourke's clock. Disengaged, moving to the auxiliary egress shaft, Varric reported. He reached the narrow, vertical shaft, the only path back to the temporary command center. He pulled himself through the hatch, slamming it shut behind him just as the automated system isolated the failing section with a deep, resonant hum. Inside the egress, the environment was better, but the air still felt thick and vitiated. Varric ripped off his helmet, breathing hard. Report confirmed, Ash said, her voice now back on standard comms, less frantic. We lost the pylon. We gained 30 hours on the overall political narrative. Excellent work, Stonehall. Varric ignored the forced compliment. He spat a mouthful of metallic-tasting saliva onto the grating. We didn't just lose the pylon, Rowan. We cracked the primary housing. Did your telemetry pick up the origin of that failure wave? Stress fracture, localized thermal expansion. Textbook result of pushing 2 million kilowatts through 70-year-old wiring. Ash recited, the detached professionalism grating on Varric. No, Varric insisted, running a hand over the cold, rough metal of the hatch. That shockwave didn't originate internally. It propagated. Look at the three-dimensional scan data. That fracture point was impacted from outside the housing at least microseconds before the system overloaded. Silence again. This time, the silence was not exhaustion. It was apprehension. Stonehall, the only thing outside the primary housing is the containment shell and vacuum, Ash stated slowly. I know what the schematics say, Rowan, but the fracture signature is localized impact energy, not thermal fatigue. Varric's mind raced, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. If the pressure spike had been external, something else was active on Verlasung-Drei, something that predated the human arrival, or something that had survived the consensus 80 years of calculated neglect. He climbed quickly down the shaft, the heavy smell of burnt electronics increasing with every meter. He emerged into the cramped utility hall where Ash was waiting, already reviewing the raw telemetry data. She looked up, her face pale under the harsh emergency lighting. Commander Rourke is demanding a full analysis of the incident before the vigilance of principals arrives, she said, nodding toward the data pad. He wants the incident classified as structural failure due to pre-existing alien decay. No mention of external factors. Varric pointed a trembling finger at the display, where a faint, dark ripple was visible on the pressure graph, preceding the internal overload. Look at the timing, Rowan. What if Zoraz was right? What if the consensus wasn't just neglectful? What if they engineered the failure, leaving a residual operational system designed to... A low-frequency tremor shook the utility hall, far deeper and more complex than the previous power failure. This felt structural, tectonic. A red light flashed on the strategic overview display. Unidentified, subsurface, energy signature detected. Ash's eyes widened, locking onto the coordinates. That signature, it's emanating from beneath the original Krellin assembly hall, the ruins where Rourke made his declaration of protection. Varric grabbed the wall for support, his injured shoulders screaming in protest. The floor beneath them hummed with a profound, terrifying energy. It was the sound of something waking up, something that had been sleeping for 80 cycles in the dust of the forgotten colony. They didn't just forget this place, Rowan, Varric whispered, the realization hitting him with cold force. The consensus left the Krellin to die, but they didn't leave empty-handed. They left a time-delayed weapon buried beneath the political theater, and we just powered it up. Ash swallowed hard, her gaze flicking between Varric's shattered expression and the violently shaking coordinates on the screen. Varric, what do we do? He looked down at his bloodied, useless suit glove, then back at the display. The injustice of his near death was irrelevant now. They had traded their slow, quiet death for an explosive future, just as Rourke predicted. Only the explosion wasn't coming from the consensus fleet, it was coming from below their feet. We report structural failure, Varric stated, his voice flat, defeated. And then we prepare to fight the ghosts the consensus left behind. Get me a full combat loadout, Sergeant. Tell Rourke the engineering crew is going underground. We need to know exactly what the cost of this shield is before it kills every last soul on Verlasung-Drei. The sudden stop of the seismic tremor was worse than the shaking itself. It left a painful, high-frequency ring in Varick's ears, a residual ghost of the energy discharge. Sergeant Ash stood frozen, the harsh emergency lighting painting the raw fear on her face. The utility hall now smelled strongly of ozone and wet earth, an impossible combination in a sealed facility 40 meters up. Varick shoved his damaged suit glove into the pocket of his field jacket. The adrenaline that had spiked during the near-fatal pylon failure was now burning off, leaving a bitter, metallic taste and the deep throb of his dislocated shoulder. He focused on Ash, demanding control. The coordinates, Sergeant. Cross-reference the energy spike with known consensus demolition signatures. Ash forced herself to move, her fingers flying across the data pad, seeking institutional comfort in data parsing. No demolition signature, Varick. The energy output is too clean, too broad spectrum. It's consistent with the initial power-up of a long-dormant Kralin structure. She looked up, her expression strained, but buried deep, at least 2 kilometers down, directly beneath the assembly hall. A structure designed to be dormant for 80 cycles, then spontaneously power up the moment a human directorate ship secures a power tether, Varick said. The irony, a heavy, sickening weight. It's too neat, Rowan. The consensus didn't just forget them. They set a booby trap, a philosophical grenade designed to explode the moment someone tried to claim the political high ground. He stepped toward the armory cage, ignoring the pain that shot down his left arm. He needed a weapon, a kinetic projection rifle, something heavy enough to ground him. He felt the cold sweat on his back, the faint, persistent image of his wife, Lena, holding their daughter, 7 years old, standing on the observation deck of their last home station before he deployed. Duty first, Varick. Always duty. The memory was a dull ache. He knew, with absolute certainty, that Rourke's political agenda was not duty. Ash didn't follow him to the armory. She stayed by the terminal, pulling up encrypted communication logs. Rourke is on the horn, demanding the structural failure report be submitted immediately. He says the arbitration vessel is 2 hours out, and he needs a clean narrative for their arrival. He needs to spin this as us heroically battling pre-existing decay, not us negligently activating a deep-cycle weapon platform. Varick selected a short-barreled carbine, checking the thermal clip capacity. 25 rounds, not nearly enough for 2 kilometers of unknown tunnels. Tell Rourke the report is drafted, pending final verification of the subsurface seismic event. He won't accept that, Varick. He's insisting on immediate compliance. The political clock is ticking louder than the actual crisis clock for him. If we stall, he'll replace us with a team that will sign off on the lie. Ash's voice cracked slightly. He threatens to classify this entire investigation as insubordination undermining strategic objectives. That means loss of rank, loss of pay, and mandatory rotation to Sector 7 garbage haulage. Varick slammed the clip home, the sharp click, a sound of definitive break from protocol. Rourke is prioritizing narrative stability over life support stability. That subsurface signature is draining power from the Eclipse Haven defense grid we just nearly died installing. If it continues to ramp up, the orbital shield will fail completely, just as the vigilance of principles arrives. That means the Krellin lose their shield, we lose our strategic advantage, and Rourke loses his command. He slung the carbine over his good shoulder. The metallic, pervasive humming from below the floor was escalating, vibrating through the bones of his feet. The consensus isn't stupid, Rowan. They knew this system, whatever it is, would use Krellin technology. Only the Krellin know how to turn it off, or even what it does. Rourke's political victory, declaring protection, just tied us to the people the consensus designated as collateral damage. He moved to the ventilation shaft that led down toward the lower utility levels, the closest path to the assembly hall ruins. Varick, listen to me, Ash pleaded. gripping the cold steel of the terminal desk. If we go underground now, without Rourke's explicit operational directive, we are abandoning our post during a critical diplomatic window. We are officially going rogue. Varric stopped at the hatch. He stared at the floor, thinking about the fractured pylon housing, thinking about the Krellin, Elder, Zoraz, who had stared at him with such profound, justified mistrust. He saw the truth in Zoraz's eyes, that humanity was just as prone to calculated indifference as the consensus, simply substituting strategic interest for outright neglect. Rogue, Varric repeated, tasting the word. The hierarchy views this entire assignment as a low-risk, high-return political theater. They don't value our lives, Rowan. They value the integrity of the mission report. He thought of the hundreds of Krellin citizens living below the assembly hall, not in luxury, but clinging to the remnants of their civilization. They weren't fighting the human directorate. They were fighting the death sentence imposed by the consensus 80 years ago. And now, humanity had arrived, declaring them protected, only to accidentally start the execution clock. We follow the signal. Rowan, Varric decided, his voice low and firm. Rourke is going to protect his political standing. We are going to protect the people he claimed ownership of. He looked back at Ash, meeting her eyes. She was a sergeant, trained to follow directives to maintain order. Her face was a battlefield of protocol versus conscience. I need you to stay up here, Varric instructed. Continue to feed Rourke the narrative he wants, slow drip analysis, emphasis on alien decay. But run a separate, secured channel to me. Patch me into the Krellin subsurface schematics, if they even exist. I need to know what technology the consensus decided was too dangerous to destroy outright, but too useful to simply forget. Ash swallowed again, looking at the display where the red, throbbing energy signature intensified beneath the assembly hall. The sound of the hum was now a deep, grinding thrum, resonating throughout the utility deck. If Rourke finds out, Varric, they won't just strip your rank. They'll bury you. They'll bury both of us. Varric nodded, pulling the hatch release handle. The rusted mechanism groaned in protest, releasing a puff of stale, musty air, the air of forgotten things. Rowan, Rourke already decided we were expendable the moment he ordered that 48-hour timeline. We already knew the cost of the shield, Varric whispered, lowering himself into the vertical shaft. Now we find out the cost of the weapon. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Rowan Ash alone in the utility hall, poised between the safety of institutional lies and the terrifying truth vibrating beneath the metal floor. She watched the coordinates on the screen, seeing the subsurface energy signature peak, then begin an organized, focused ascent. It was no longer a surge. It was a trajectory. Something massive was moving upward, fast, toward the ruins of the assembly hall. Ash grabbed a spare field rifle, her hands shaking not from fear, but from the cold realization of necessary treason. She keyed the secure channel, bypassing the command net entirely. The time for protocol had ended. The time for fighting ghosts had begun. The time for fighting ghosts had begun, and the darkness of the ventilation shaft swallowed Varric's Stonehall whole. It was a descent into the planet's circulatory system, a claustrophobic mesh of pipes and conduits that choked the space between the habitat domes and the deep bedrock. The air immediately grew thick, laden with the smell of decades-old hydrocarbon residue and the sharp, metallic tang of stressed, superheated wiring. He dropped 30 meters, hand over hand, relying on his right arm, the left screaming a constant, low-grade protest against the movement. The deep, organized thrum of the ascending energy signature grew louder, vibrating through the titanium-plated walls of the shaft. It wasn't just energy. It had mass, and it was moving with purpose. Ash, status report. Give me thermal mapping and spectral analysis, Varric demanded into the throat mic, his voice tight. Rowan Ash's response was instant, filtered through the static of the deep ground interference. The subterranean energy source is accelerating, Varric. Velocity is approximately 8 meters per second, trajectory locked onto the center of the assembly hall. The energy output is fluctuating, non-standard. It's cycling between two frequencies, one high band, localized electrical discharge, and one low band, seismic dampening. Varric reached the first junction, landing heavily on a narrow maintenance catwalk that groaned under his weight. Dust, heavy and gray, puffed up around his boots. He adjusted the settings on his carbine, switching the scope to thermal imaging. The tunnel before him was a chaotic, winding mess, clearly abandoned since the Krellin retreat 80 years prior. Dampening, Varric repeated, moving forward cautiously. It's stabilizing its ascent, preventing further tremors. This thing isn't a kinetic impact weapon, Rowan. It's engineered. It wants a clean emergence. Varric, I found the schematic. It's highly corrupted, but the Krellin data refers to a deep cycle mechanism called the Carnith Resonator. Not a weapon, a planetary relocation beacon. Varric froze, the implications hitting him with the force of a physical blow. A beacon? After 80 years? Why? The data is sparse, but the consensus assessment classifies the resonator as catastrophic risk, non-destructible. They didn't destroy it, they buried it and starved it of power. Our human power tether must have woken it up, like jump-starting a dead heart. Varric, if this beacon activates, it doesn't just call a friend. It might initiate a localized spatial displacement field. Translate that, Rowan. What does spatial displacement mean for the surface? Total atmospheric shear, followed by extreme gravitational warping, Ash stated, her voice trembling now, fear cutting through her professional detachment. It means the assembly hall, and every Krellin structure nearby, will be ripped from the planet and thrown into localized deep space. Instant, clean extinction. Varric scrambled, adrenaline overriding the searing pain in his shoulder. The consensus hadn't just intended to kill the Krellin, they had packaged their death as a political impossibility. Any force attempting to aid them would unwittingly trigger the execution. The supreme, elegant arrogance of it made Varric's stomach turn. He reached a cavernous utility chamber where massive, dust-covered coolant pipes ran up the vertical wall. The temperature in the chamber was rising exponentially, the air thick with the smell of hot copper and ozone. He needed to buy time. If the Carnith Resonator was designed for relocation, it would require immense, uninterrupted power flow. Disrupt the power. Rowan, I'm at the central coolant exchange chamber. Locate the primary energy conduits feeding the resonator. I'm going to attempt a localized phase distortion to cut the flow. Ash was quiet for 6 seconds, the longest silence Varric had experienced since the descent. Varric, I have the schematics. There are 3 conduits, all triple-hardened Krellin alloy. They run through a 90-year-old access coupling, designated the Widow's Knot. It's shielded, impossible to breach kinetically. Impossible is subjective, Sergeant. Give me the frequency. If I hit the conduits with an opposing magnetic pulse, I can create a temporary ripple effect, a localized brownout. I need 10 seconds max. Frequency is 920 megahertz phased cycle. Varric, if you fail, the feedback loop from that much raw energy will incinerate everything within 50 meters. Understood. Varric sighted his carbine, adjusting the settings. It was a kinetic projection rifle designed for tactical penetration, but Varric had modified the thermal core. He didn't have high explosives. He had precise, focused energy. He fired the first pulse, not at the conduits, but at the ancient, rusting coupling point where the 3 lines converged. The sound was not an explosion, but a high-pitched electric shriek. The air around the coupling shimmered violently, like heat haze above scorched asphalt. The thermal pulse struck the widow's knot, and for a glorious, agonizing second, the deep subterranean hum faltered. It worked. Power drop registered 30%. Ash yelled triumphantly over the comms. But the success was fleeting. The residual energy of the resonator system reacted instantly. Where Varric expected structural damage, the ancient Krellin alloy merely absorbed the energy, glowing a sickly, pulsating orange. Then, the system returned the favor. A localized pulse of pure electrical energy shot back from the coupling point. Varric wasn't fast enough. The residual charge hit the right side of his chest plate, the good side, and threw him backward 30 feet against a massive coolant pipe. The impact slammed the air from his lungs. Varric lay gasping, the smell of burnt flesh filling his nostrils. His vision was a kaleidoscope of red and black, and his right arm, the one he depended on, felt paralyzed. The carbine lay shattered on the floor 10 feet away, its sophisticated optics reduced to slag. "Varric, report. We lost the signal." Ash's voice was frantic, swallowed by the sudden return of the relentless, grinding thrum from below. The power drop had lasted less than 3 seconds. Varric struggled to draw breath, dragging himself painfully back into a sitting position against the cold pipe. The electrical surge had bypassed his external armor, burning the synthetic weave of his undershirt and locking the muscles in his right shoulder in excruciating spasms. Now both shoulders were effectively useless. "Negative effect, Rowan," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. The Krellin shielding compensated immediately. "The power surge is back to 100% and accelerating. My primary weapon is inoperable." The heat in the chamber was unbearable now, rising toward 50 degrees Celsius. Varric fumbled with his belt, pulling out his multi-tool, a simple kinetic blade. He looked at the 3 conduits, still glowing orange. They were the key, but he had no way to breach them. "Varric, the velocity estimate puts the resonator breach in less than 10 minutes. The Krellin community is right above it," Ash urged, desperation edging her tone. Varric forced his thoughts past the pain. The plan had failed because he attacked the technology. He needed to attack the logistics. "Rowan," he gritted out, "the resonator needs cooling. Find me the failsafe, the secondary release valve for the coolant system. It will be protected, likely keyed to a Krellin biolock, but it's our only chance to flood the chamber and introduce resistance." Ash's data feed flickered back online, heavy with static. Found it. Designated Control Node Gamma, located 600 meters down the main conduit line. It requires physical input, a rotating key sequence, and a secondary bioscan. But Varric, I have an anomaly. Spit it out, Sergeant. The original schematics show a Krellin maintenance drone designated Pioneer 1, lost 80 years ago during the original burial. My systems are picking up its residual power signature, moving toward your position. It appears operational, though heavily degraded. Varric looked into the shadows of the chamber. He saw movement, a low-slung, boxy machine, its metal casing rusted and scarred, but its single optical sensor glowing a faint, tired blue. "A maintenance drone," Varric muttered, a flicker of dark hope amidst the pain. "The ultimate ghost. Does it have mechanical arms, Rowan? Can it turn a valve?" "Affirmative, but Varric, the data shows its core programming is tied to the original consensus directive. Maintain burial integrity. It might view your intervention as a threat to the resonator's dormancy." The drone, Pioneer 1, rattled closer, its treads throwing up gray dust. It stopped 5 feet away from Varric, its optical sensor fixed on his injured, sparking armor. "Rowan, I need you to rewrite its immediate operational parameters," Varric commanded, ignoring the throbbing pain and the suffocating heat. "Forget the valve for a minute. The drone needs to secure my extract. I can't move 600 meters under my own power." That is a severe breach of protocol, Varric, and its core programming is hardened. It will take me 90 seconds to even attempt to patch its secondary matrix, and I need a physical connection. Varric pointed to the shattered remnants of his carbine, where the thermal core still smoldered faintly. There is a standard data coupling port beneath the chassis. Patch into it. You have 30 seconds before this thing tries to enforce burial integrity on me. He watched the drone's mechanical arm slowly extend, not toward him, but toward the closest object of systemic failure, the ruptured joint where he had tried to pulse the conduits. The drone was prioritizing repair of Varric's damage before addressing the larger threat. It was following 80-year-old programming that deemed human interference the root cause of the current instability. Ash worked fast, the static on the comms increasing as she wrestled with the drone's antique, hostile coding. The heat in the chamber was so extreme, Varric felt the cold sweat on his forehead instantly evaporate. I'm in, attempting to overwrite primary movement parameters. It's resisting. Varric, I need to isolate the power feed from the environmental sensors, or it will continue prioritizing the heat anomaly, which is you. Do it, Varric gasped, feeling the drone's metal claw brush his field jacket. Ash's patch worked. The drone twitched, its blue eye flickering red, then stabilized. The mechanical arm retracted, then extended again, this time offering a solid, metallic grip. New primary directive, secure extraction to control node Gamma. Secondary objective, minimal kinetic engagement. Ash's voice commanded through the drone's external speaker. Varric didn't hesitate. He grabbed the drone's grip, biting back a cry as the movement sent fresh spikes of agony through his shoulder. The drone, Pioneer 1, efficiently dragged him along the maintenance catwalk, its treads surprisingly silent. 600 meters became a blur of pain, heat, and the unrelenting, escalating thrum of the Carnith resonator. They reached Control Node Gamma, a small, heavily shielded bunker set into the main coolant flow line. Varric, the node requires the Krellin key sequence, 3 rotations, counterclockwise, followed by 4 clockwise. The pressure setting must be set to precisely 765 kilopascals. Varric stared at the metallic keypad. He didn't have the strength to execute the fine motor movements, let alone the biometrics. He was forced to make the choice, the terrible Sophie's choice, of the abandoned war zone. Rowan, reroute the drone's manipulators. I need it to execute the key sequence, but it has no internal biometric access. I need to give it access. Varric, the only way to bypass the biometric lock is to use a direct biological transfer, Ash said, the horror clear in her voice. The scanner is designed for large area Krellin handprint. A human print won't work unless I create a large enough tissue sample to mimic the signature density. Varric finished grimly. He looked down at his left hand, the one he hadn't used for the carbine. The skin was already blistered and raw from the electrical surge. He took the kinetic blade and, without allowing himself the luxury of a gasp or a cry, dragged the sharp edge across the palm of his hand, peeling back a strip of damaged flesh 5 inches long. The hot, metallic scent of his own blood filled the air. Pioneer 1, Varric ordered, forcing his hand onto the scanner plate, smearing it with blood and tissue. Take the sample. Print and key sequence now. The drone followed the command instantly. It dipped its manipulator arm, secured the tissue sample, and pressed it firmly against the Krellin scanner. The panel flashed, agonizingly, then turned solid green. The drone's arm rotated the valve axis. Click, 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 then 4 precise rotations back. The control panel pulsed, showing coolant, fail-safe, override, activated. Varric fell back, the rush of cold air from the opened valve a momentary relief against the searing pain of his hand. Success! I'm initiating the flood sequence, Ash yelled, her voice ragged with relief and shared horror. But the resonator system, seemingly anticipating this very maneuver, retaliated with devastating speed. The moment the valve opened, the humming from below stopped instantly. The heat vanished. Instead, a cold, heavy silence descended, broken only by the sound of rushing, pressurized coolant. "Rowan? What happened? Did we stop it?" "Negative, Varric," Ash whispered, her systems reading the new data. "The resonator is not stopped. It shifted its energy absorption. It's now drawing ambient thermal energy from the entire upper crust. The rapid energy shift triggered an emergency protocol. Varric, the Krellin, didn't put the weapon here. The consensus did, 80 years ago, and they left a failsafe." Varric looked up, the darkness of the pipe shaft now absolute. The pressure of the air suddenly felt oppressive, heavy. "What failsafe, Rowan?" The resonator just stopped its vertical ascent and shifted 60 degrees horizontally. "Varric, it's not moving toward the assembly hall anymore. It's moving toward the deepest subsurface access shaft, the main power trunk linking the Krellin array to the human installed junction." Varric's mind reeled. If the resonator reached the main power trunk, it wouldn't just breach the human system. It would use the massive, raw power conduit to broadcast the relocation signal at maximum strength, instantly vaporizing 100 square kilometers of the surface. "And Varric," Ash added, her voice dropping to a terrified monotone, "the Karnath resonator isn't alone. The secondary signal just came online. Low-frequency energy signature moving parallel to the resonator. We don't have a name for it in the schematics, but the Krellin data marked the location with a single pictograph. The Guardian." Varric could feel the tectonic rumble begin anew, deeper, closer. He looked at the drone, Pioneer 1, now standing motionless, its primary objective complete. He was 600 meters from the immediate danger, his weapons gone, his hands ruined. The silence was gone. Now, there were two distinct, terrifying movements beneath his feet, one massive, one secondary. The price of the shield was not just the Krellin, but every scrap of human technological arrogance that had dared to interfere with the consensus calculated indifference. He tried to stand, but the pain in his shoulders and hand made him collapse onto his knees in the rushing coolant water. The Guardian was coming. The Guardian was coming. The certainty of that realization was colder than the coolant water now rushing around Varric's knees, colder than the profound indifference of the galactic space he had fallen through to land on this dust bowl. His body was a wreck. Two useless shoulders, a hand that felt like raw, burning meat, and lungs struggling against the heavy, damp air. He was 600 meters down, isolated, and facing two subterranean threats where he had expected one. "Rowan," Varric choked out, leaning heavily on the motionless Pioneer 1 drone. "That secondary signal. Give me a spectral match against any known consensus deep infiltration assets. The resonator is Krellin, but the way it reacted to the brownout, that was external logic, consensus logic." Ash's voice was strained, high-pitched with the effort of cycling massive data through the tiny, encrypted channel. "I'm in the restricted archives, Varric. Consensus black files. There's a subsection, peripheral denials, cross-referencing the low-frequency signature. Wait, I have a match." The sudden silence from Ash was more terrifying than the tremor that now began shaking the ground again, a focused, rhythmic pounding that signaled the resonator and the Guardian were nearing their target, the main human interstellar directorate power trunk. "Rowan, report." "It's a consensus asset, Varric," Ash finally whispered, the horror palpable. "Designation is Judgment Protocol. It's not a secondary weapon, it's the fail-safe controller. 80 cycles ago, when the consensus buried the resonator, they installed this protocol to monitor its dormancy. Its mandate is single objective: ensure the resonator remains dormant, or, if powered externally, ensure its activation reaches maximum broadcast capability." Varric closed his eyes, his head falling back against the cold, wet metal of control node Gamma. The supreme, horrifying irony solidified in his mind. The consensus hadn't merely neglected the Krellin, they had weaponized their neglect. They had left a trap so perfectly engineered that only an act of apparent charity, Rourke's declaration of protection, powered by human resources, could spring it. The judgment protocol wasn't protecting the Krellin, it was protecting the consensus's original strategic decision, the clean, quiet erasure of a liability. The Guardian, Varric said, the words dry and tasting of blood. It's not guarding the Krellin, it's ensuring their execution. Precisely, Ash confirmed, and our intervention at the coolant valve was logged by judgment protocol as hostile interference with the burial integrity. Its velocity is increasing. It is moving to secure the resonator and facilitate its connection to the main human power trunk, guaranteeing an immediate, maximum strength spatial displacement broadcast. The coordinates on Varric's optical display flashed red. The resonator and the Guardian were less than 300 meters from the trunk junction. They had approximately 3 minutes before breach. Varric stared at the Pioneer 1 drone, his remaining tool. It was dragging its heavy treads in the coolant, awaiting his next command. The impossible dilemma slammed into him, displacing the pain. The main power trunk was the immediate danger. If the resonator utilized the full Directorate power grid, it would vaporize the planet's surface layer, including the entire Krellin assembly hall and the human command center where Rourke and Ash were. If Varric did nothing, all were lost. He could, however, still save himself, and perhaps Rowan. The utility lines above Control Node Gamma contained an emergency ascent shaft leading to a smaller, secondary maintenance bay 3 kilometers away from the blast radius. Option A, survival. Command Pioneer 1 to haul him up the emergency shaft now. He could warn Rourke, potentially save a few high-ranking personnel, and submit a truthful report that would likely cost him everything, but he would survive. He would leave the hundreds of Krellin citizens and dozens of human engineers on Verlasung Drei to be atomized by the broadcast. He would prove Zora's right, that human pragmatism ultimately translates to clean, civilized extinction. Option B, sacrifice. He had to use the one advantage he had, the massive power in the trunk junction itself. If he could reach the junction before the resonator, he could attempt to reroute the sheer output of the human generators into an anti-phase field, hoping to destroy the resonator with its own energy source. This was a physical impossibility, given his condition and the speed of the approaching threats, and if he failed, he would be at ground zero. Varric looked down at his ruined hands, the pain a distant, buzzing noise against the immediate, crystalline clarity of the decision. Rourke had leveraged Krellin, suffering for strategic gain, hiding their lives behind a flimsy shield. That shield was about to be obliterated by a weapon planted by the very consensus Rourke intended to defy. The cost of Rourke's shield was Varric's life, and the lives of the Krellin who had already endured 80 years of waiting for death. He looked at the drone. Pioneer 1, new directive, priority override, full speed extraction toward the main power trunk junction, access junction 5703. Varric, that's impossible. Ash screamed over the comms, the static almost overwhelming her fear. You can't intercept it. The Guardian is moving too fast. You won't make it to the terminal. You'll be crushed between the two systems. I don't need to make it to the terminal, Rowan. I need to get close enough to the raw power flow. Varric gritted out, the words squeezed past the pain. The Krellin resonator is designed to draw power, not repel it. The power trunk is our weapon. But I need to reroute Pioneer 1's internal matrix. He reached for the drone's exposed data port, the proximity of the metal casing causing fresh sparks to leap from his injured jacket. His bleeding hand shook violently, but he found the port and plunged the drone's own charging cable into the receiver. Rowan, I'm attempting to hardwire the drone's secondary processors. I need you to execute a 5-step localized code injection, override Pioneer 1's movement sensors, and connect them directly to the power trunk's phase coupling system. If I can't operate the terminal, the drone will have to execute the anti-phase sequence remotely. It's our only chance to weaponize the trunk. Varric, that modification is lethal. The feedback loop from the power trunk will fry every circuit in Pioneer 1, and you're tethered to it. Ash protested. We can still make the emergency shaft. I am not abandoning this colony, Varric stated, the phrase not a moment of heroism, but a statement of institutional fatigue. He had signed off on the Krellin's protection, even if Rourke viewed it as a temporary political maneuver. He had a duty, not to Rourke, but to the truth of the sacrifice. He forced his fingers, sticky with blood, onto the drone's external controls, manually forcing the treads forward. Start the injection, Rowan. Now. Ash didn't argue further. The sound of her rapid typing filled the comms channel, a testament to her own moral breaking point. Varric was dragged through the cold, pressurized coolant, the Pioneer 1 drone moving with surprising speed. The structural rumble ahead was now a continuous roar. The light ahead was a sickly, violent green, illuminating the vast, cavernous junction chamber where the massive human-installed power trunk sliced through the bedrock. Injection phase 3 of 5 complete, Ash yelled. The drone is rerouting telemetry now. Varric, the Guardian is slowing. It must have detected the foreign code injection. Varric looked ahead. 200 meters. He could see the shapes now. The massive segmented cylinder of the Carnith resonator vibrating violently, boring toward the trunk, and paralleling it, a smooth, obsidian black entity, the Guardian, a creature of pure consensus design, silent and lethal, its movement unnaturally fluid. I need to reach the phase coupling access panel, Varric ordered. 100 meters. Varric, the Guardian is accelerating again. It knows what we're doing. It's prioritizing neutralization of Pioneer 1. A high-pitched, metallic shriek tore through the air as the Guardian emitted a focused, sonic pulse. The drone shuddered violently. Varric felt the pressure wave hit his body, driving the pain in his shoulders to a crippling new height. 5 of 5 complete. The drone is armed, Varric. It's ready to receive the anti-phase command. Ash screamed. They burst into the junction chamber. The noise was deafening. The grinding of the resonator against the bedrock, the whine of the human generators above, and the terrifying, silent approach of the Black Guardian. Varric used his last ounce of strength, slamming his body against the primary junction column. Pioneer 1, execute anti-phase sequence. Alpha, target, resonator core. The drone's manipulator snapped forward, not to connect with the resonator, but to lock onto the massive surging power trunk. The green light around the coupling intensified to a blinding white. Varric felt the enormous surge of power bypass the drone's fragile circuits. The cable tethering him to the drone vaporized, turning the air instantly into ozone. Pioneer 1 didn't explode. It became a conduit for 2 million kilowatts of pure human energy directed against the Krellin weapon. The resonator screamed, a mechanical shriek of pure digital anguish. It began to vibrate, tearing itself apart from the inside as the anti-phase energy ripped through its stabilizing fields. "It's working," Ash shouted, her voice breaking through the static. The resonator is collapsing, power drop at 90%. But the Judgment Protocol, the Guardian, was not built to be fragile. It reacted with cold, calculated speed. It abandoned the resonator entirely, and with a terrifying lack of urgency, redirected its focus onto the source of the interference, the human command, uplink. A silent, invisible wave of data warfare hit the drone. Pioneer 1 instantly went dead, melting into a puddle of slag beside Varric. The comms link to Rowan Ash was severed instantly, replaced by a dense, agonizing silence. Varric was alone, deafened, half blinded by the energy discharge, and physically broken, leaning against the humming power trunk. He looked up. The Carnith resonator was a shattered husk, its internal machinery exposed and sparking. But the Guardian was still functional, and it was no longer advancing on the power trunk. It was advancing on Varric. The obsidian entity stopped 10 feet away, where its optical sensors should have been. A single, pulsating red light began to glow, and from its internal speaker, a voice, synthesized and flat, speaking in flawless interstellar directorate protocol. Interference neutralized, secondary objective activated, biological contamination elimination. Varric Stonehall slumped to the floor, the cold water washing over his ruined hand, just as the seismic monitoring display he had attached to his jacket, a piece of useless vanity now, flashed an urgent message. The vigilance of principles had just secured orbit above Verlasungray, and in the ruins of the assembly hall, 1 kilometer above Varric's position, Elder Zoras watched the pale yellow sky, finally realizing the full, terrifying price of human protection. Below, the Guardian began its slow, deliberate advance. Varric had traded one ghost for a sentient executioner. The synthetic voice of the judgment protocol, flat and toneless, cut through the physical agony like a rusty saw. Biological contamination elimination. It was a statement of policy, not a threat. The machine was advancing, its obsidian chassis reflecting the dying sparks of the ruined resonator, and Varric Stonehall knew that his reckless sacrifice had only secured a few more minutes of life for the Krellin above, while simultaneously guaranteeing his own immediate extinction. He tried to push himself off the floor, the effort sending spears of white-hot pain from his shredded hand up his arm. The heavy, damp air of the junction chamber felt less like atmosphere and more like the physical weight of 2 galactic empires crushing him. The raw energy discharge had deafened his left ear entirely, leaving a high-pitched metallic whine in the vacuum of his skull. The right side of his body, hit by the electrical backlash, was leaden, refusing command. The Guardian stopped 5 feet away. Its movement was not mechanical, but geological, profound and slow. Varric was contamination, an anomaly to be erased, a messy biological glitch in the consensus's perfect 80-year-old protocol. He realized the horror of the silence now. Rowan Ash was gone. The Pioneer's one drone, the only thing tethering him to the world above, was slag. He was alone with a sentient, philosophical assassin that viewed him as industrial waste. His defeat was complete. The Guardian extended a manipulator arm designed not for crushing, but for surgical dissolution. Varric didn't flinch. He just slumped further, his chin resting on his chest, staring at the cold, rushing coolant water around his knees. He had failed. He had attempted to defy a century of calculated indifference with a single, desperate, and fundamentally flawed technical maneuver. The Krellin were temporarily safe from the spatial displacement, but the arrival of the vigilance of principles above meant the political trap was sprung. Rourke would have his narrative, a heroic recovery from alien decay, but the consensus would simply demand the return of the colony, now stripped of its immediate tactical liability. Varric had merely cleaned up the consensus's mess, paving the way for a smooth, diplomatic surrender. You risked everything, Varric, and you accomplished nothing. The thought was heavier than the power trunk itself. It was the absolute bottom. He had not abandoned the colony for survival, but his attempt to save it had only confirmed Zoraz's bitter prognosis. Humanity was capable of great effort, but only when driven by self-interest. Whether strategic, Rourke, or moral, Varric. The difference was one of motivation, not outcome. They both leveraged Krellin's suffering. He felt the heavy fatigue of industrial-scale collapse settling into his bones. He was tired of the heat, the constant whine of failing systems, the impossible moral compromises that were the daily bread of interstellar directorate service. He closed his eyes, accepting the sharp, clean death the Guardian offered. Survival meant facing the internal inquest, the shame, the loss of rank, the mandatory debrief where he would have to lie to Rourke to protect Rowan. Death was easier. Elimination sequence initiated. The synthesized voice was right above him. Then a flicker. Not a heroic flash of insight, but a brief, agonizing spike in the electrical field. The Guardian's arm froze less than a foot from Varric's face. Varric opened his eyes. The obsidian chassis of the Guardian was stable, but the red pulsating light in its sensor array was stuttering, blinking rapidly. Red, blank, red, blank. System anomaly. Unidentified foreign protocol ingress. The Guardian was fighting something internally. Varric, even in his stupor, registered the signature. A low-band, highly compressed digital packet attempting to penetrate the consensus unit's command matrix. Rowan. She wasn't dead. When the Guardian neutralized the drone, it severed the physical comms link, but it must have been actively receiving the final stages of the code injection Varric had demanded. The anti-phase sequence designed to weaponize the drone must have contained a digital payload Rowan had preloaded, a last-ditch infection meant to bypass the Guardian's firewalls. The Guardian shifted its focus from Varric to its own internal state. Firewall breach detected. Source, uncategorized. Classification, high priority threat to primary protocol. Varric felt a desperate, cold surge of clarity. Rowan hadn't tried to save him. She had injected a ghost protocol into the Guardian, something designed to distract it long enough for her to re-establish communications. Or perhaps, he looked at the shattered remains of the Pioneer 1 drone, now cooling rapidly. The drone's melted carcass was fused to the charging cable that had vaporized an inch from his left hip. The raw data stream flowing through the drone was not entirely gone. The massive surge of power had only destroyed the highly sensitive control logic, leaving residual, heavy-duty memory banks intact. Varric needed to move. If Rowan was fighting the Guardian in the deep network, she was buying him perhaps 60 seconds, maybe less. The Guardian's internal logic was ancient, designed only to manage the resonator. It was vulnerable to anything novel, anything human in its aggression. He dragged his right hand across his body, feeling the searing pain in his back and shoulder. His left hand, ruined and sticky with blood, was the only one with fine motor control. He forced his bleeding fingers toward the melted drone carcass, searching for the charging cable remnant. Primary objective reprioritized, elimination of foreign protocol ingress. The Guardian's red light solidified. It abandoned Varric entirely, turning its obsidian chassis 90 degrees, focusing its computational power entirely on expelling Rowan's digital infection. Varric found the remnants of the cable. It was fused, hot and rough. He didn't have a data reader, a terminal, or a power source. He had only the power trunk humming next to him, and the drone's ruined shell. He remembered the Krellin schematics Rowan had forced through the comms. The Guardian, the Judgment Protocol, was a monitor. Monitors needed to report, and monitors buried for 80 cycles needed to ensure that their eventual report followed the proper, ancient chain of command. The Guardian must communicate with its point of origin. Varric remembered a minute detail from the corrupted data packets. The Guardian utilized a localized, low-frequency broadcast antenna, not for general communications, but for direct, coded access to the consensus vessel that had originally buried it, a vessel long gone. Varric looked at the drone's shell. It was heavy, dense metal, designed for excavation. He needed to find the drone's remnant antenna assembly, rip it free, and shove it onto the Guardian, while Rowan's distraction held the machine motionless. He needed to give the Guardian a corrupted physical comms link that would force it to broadcast Rowan's ghost protocol at maximum strength, overloading its own central processor. It was insane. It was a technical suicide attempt built on 3 layers of structural failure. Using his good arm, he crawled over the sharp debris of the drone, his movements slow and agonizingly heavy. He found the antenna, a short, stubby rod of synthetic metal, cracked but intact. He ripped it free, feeling the last bit of synthetic skin on his palm tear away. 10 seconds remaining until protocol purge complete. The Guardian announced its success in the battle against Rowan Ash's ghost. Varric braced his body against the primary power trunk, the vibration soothing the pain. He held the antenna in his bleeding left hand. The Guardian slowly began to turn back toward him, its biological elimination objective re-established. Varric looked up, seeing the reflection of his own exhausted, blood-soaked face in the polished black chassis of the Judgment Protocol. "It doesn't matter if you live or die now, Varric." The whisper of defeat was cold, but Rowan deserves the time to run. He launched himself forward in a single, painful, desperate lunge, ignoring the tearing pain in his shoulders. He didn't aim for the sensor array. He aimed for the exposed joint panel on the Guardian's back, the one exposed during its internal data warfare. He slammed the drone antenna deep into the panel, driving the jagged metal into the Guardian's data port. The effect was instantaneous. The Guardian didn't scream or explode. It went rigid. The red pulsating light in its sensor turned an agonizing, blinding white, and its synthesized voice, now overlaid with the high-pitched static of system overload, shrieked a single, final phrase of consensus protocol: unidentified, biological. Threat level, transcendence, primary, objective, override. Varric fell away as the entire junction chamber lit up with a massive surge of uncontrolled energy. The sound was a unified crack that fractured the bedrock around the power trunk, sending heavy metal plating tearing from the walls. Varric shielded his eyes, feeling the heat of the exploding Guardian wash over him. Not the cold, surgical death he had expected, but a chaotic, industrial end. When the light faded, the silence returned, heavier and more complete than before. The coolant water still rushed, but the deep, structural hum of the power trunk had faltered, temporarily silenced by the systemic shock wave. Varric lay in the dark, breathing the thick, ozone-heavy air. He could no longer feel his left arm, and his right shoulder was screaming a continuous, high-volume protest. He had destroyed the Guardian. He had saved the Krellin for now, but he was still 600 meters down, in a collapsing hole, alone, and critically wounded, and he was officially guilty of sabotaging an estimated 20 million credits worth of Directorate assets, all to save a colony Rourke deemed merely collateral. He tried the comms. Nothing. Just the high-pitched feedback whine of a broken system. Varric dragged himself toward the power trunk, reaching the junction column with immense effort. He noticed, just as his eyes adjusted to the residual glow, a hairline fracture in the trunk itself, caused by the Guardian's final, violent self-destruction. Through the fracture, a faint, almost imperceptible red light pulsed. Not mechanical, but biological. Varric realized the awful final irony. The Guardian was destroyed, but its ultimate mission was fulfilled. The consensus had designed the Judgment Protocol not only to monitor the Krellin weapon, but also to leave a highly corrosive biological signature upon destruction, specifically designed to contaminate the human infrastructure that had interfered. He could feel a deep, throbbing sickness beginning in his lungs, exacerbated by the polluted air. He had traded his life for the colony's short-term safety, but he had opened the gates for a new, invisible war. Varric fumbled for his small emergency data logger, a simple, non-electronic memory chip. He held it tightly in his ruined hand, forcing himself to focus on the fracture. He had to record the biological signature. He had to warn Rourke. He looked back toward the emergency ascent shaft, the small, narrow path to survival 3 kilometers away. The thought of crawling that far with a broken body and a contaminated environment was a mountain. But the alternative, letting Rourke continue the political narrative, unaware of the biological warfare now creeping into Verlassung Drei's support systems, was worse. He needed to get that data above ground. He needed to fail upward. Varric shoved the data logger into his field jacket and began dragging his heavy, defeated body across the cold, wet floor, one painful, agonizing meter at a time, towards the ascent shaft, knowing that every breath he took sealed his fate. He had bought the colony time, but his defeat was absolute. The consensus always planned for the human response, and their ultimate weapon was slow, systemic contamination. He made it 10 meters before the ground began to tremble again, not with the grinding of machinery, but with the massive, structured step of a new arrival. Not the vigilance of principles which was in orbit, but something descending through the massive main transit shafts, heavy, armed, human. A command voice, distorted by the shaft acoustics, boomed down the corridor. "This is Commander Rourke, Sector 7 Investigative Detail. Varric Stonehall, you are in violation of multiple directives. Engineering team, secure the rogue asset. Dead or alive, I need a signed report before the arbitration vessel lands." Varric froze, the realization cold and absolute. Rourke had not been fooled by Rowan's stalling. He had merely waited until the crisis passed, then moved to eliminate the messy, inconvenient truth. Varric had traded his life for the Krelin's temporary safety, only to be hunted by the very protection he had sworn to uphold. He heard the heavy, rhythmic beat of armored boots approaching in the dark. He had less than 30 seconds. His ruined body could not outrun them. Varric looked at the coolant water, then at the massive, cracked support column beside him. He needed one last, desperate measure, one final, insane act of self-preservation disguised as sabotage. He reached for the cold, jagged edge of the column, forcing his remaining strength into his right arm, preparing to create a diversion that would flood the entire lower sector, burying himself and Rourke's detail in a torrent of water and debris. He had nothing left to lose but the chance to tell the truth. "Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country, or planet, are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal." Varric drove the jagged edge of the fractured support column against the main coolant pipe junction, leveraging his entire body weight against the resisting synthetic metal. His right shoulder socket gave way with a wet, grinding protest, a searing explosion of pain contained entirely within his damaged nervous system. He wasn't aiming to puncture the pipe. He was aiming to induce a catastrophic thermal shock, exploiting the structural fatigue the Guardian's self-destruction had created. The armored boots of Rourke's detail were now 40 feet away, their heavy footfalls muted but relentless in the oppressive atmosphere. "Stonehall, cease and desist immediately. Failure to comply will result in summary classification as hostile asset." Commander Rourke's voice boomed from a megaphone, sterile and utterly devoid of mercy. Varric ignored him. He strained, the metal protesting against the pressure. The coolant system, engineered by the consensus 80 years prior, was designed with a single-minded priority: protect the central Krellin weapon, Resonator, from any operational fluctuation. Varric knew that disrupting the main feed would trigger the automatic pressure equalization system, demanding an instantaneous, massive volume draw from the secondary reservoir 6 floors above. The resulting vacuum spike would tear the already compromised metal infrastructure apart. A flash of heavy tactical illumination rounded the final corner of the flooded corridor, momentarily blinding Varric. He saw the outlines of 3 human soldiers encased in heavy combat exoskeletons, their weapons raised and stabilized. "Final warning, Stonehall. Drop the data logger and secure yourself," Rourke commanded. Varric summoned the last, exhausted reservoir of his strength, forcing the structural crack further into the pipe junction. The primary system hissed, a violent, high-pressure rupture tearing along the seam. It was the sound of catastrophic failure. The effect was not instantaneous, but systemic. For a fraction of a second, the corridor lights dimmed as the system allocated every available joule to stabilize the breach. Then, the ceiling above them groaned, a deep, resonating sound of metal tearing from bedrock. The tactical detail halted, momentarily stunned by the magnitude of the structural collapse. They were trained for firefights and arrests, not for managing the internal liquidation of a deep sub-level maintenance deck. The column buckled with a horrifying noise, a single, definitive crack that sounded like tearing paper. It was immediately followed by the guttural roar of millions of liters of pressurized coolant, mineral-rich sediment, and crushed debris cascading down the main shaft. Varric was instantly submerged. The freezing water hit his fevered, contaminated skin like a million needles, the shock stealing his breath and sending his body into spasm. He tumbled, disoriented, blinded by the churned sediment. His only thought was the precious data logger chip containing the biological contamination signature held tightly in the pocket of his field jacket. The current was brutal. It snatched him, slamming him against a twisted section of conduit. The impact knocked the last air from his lungs, and he felt the small, hard mass of the data chip rip free from the weakened seam of his jacket pocket. It spun away into the dark, swirling torrent, lost in the chaotic, industrial flood. The tactical detail, trapped by the sudden, localized deluge, reacted immediately. He heard the muffled, high-pitched commands of Rourke ordering retreat and SEAL protocols. They were human. They would not risk their assets, the 3 armored soldiers, for a low-level technician who was now drowning in a non-essential sector. Rourke had lost the fight, but he prioritized systemic survival over messy justice. Varric was dragged 20 meters before the water began to stabilize, settling into a deep, cold, fast-moving river. He managed to grab hold of a surviving power conduit, pulling himself upward until his head breached the surface of the freezing water. The lower sector was utterly transformed. The blinding lights were replaced by sporadic, epileptic flashes of ruptured emergency strobes. The air was thick with mist and the noxious chemical tang of the coolant, a mix of water, specialized minerals, and the highly corrosive residue of the exploded Guardian, the biological weapon. He was alive. He had bought himself time, but the cost was absolute. He struggled onto a floating piece of metal grating, coughing violently, lungs burning from the polluted air. His right shoulder was useless, dislocated or worse. His left hand, still bleeding internally, felt heavy and numb. The data logger was gone. All physical evidence of the consensus's biological contingency, the truth that undermined Rourke's entire political maneuver, was now buried beneath tons of cold water and debris. Rourke had retreated. The pursuit was momentarily stalled. Varric was 600 meters down, catastrophically wounded, contaminated, and devoid of proof. He was a liability, and now he was isolated in a drowning, toxic grave. He dragged his body across the grating, seeking the nearest vertical structure. He found a small, secondary maintenance junction box fused into the wall above the flood line. It was useless for comms, its primary transceiver likely slag, but it had a localized tertiary power terminal. If Rowan Ash was still alive, if she was still fighting Rourke's attempts to scrub the truth from the system, she would be monitoring the lowest, most insignificant power fluctuation points. Varric reached the box and pried it open with a painful shove of his good arm. Inside, a cluster of ancient low-voltage Krellin wiring remained. This wiring was shielded. It was never meant for data transmission, only for emergency lighting. It was a wire that Rourke's Directorate engineers would have entirely ignored. He needed to establish a minimal, coded pulse. He needed to transmit the biological signature data, the specific frequency and molecular structure of the contaminant, using nothing but short-circuit pulses on an obsolete lighting circuit. He had to rely purely on his contaminated memory. He tore 2 lengths of exposed wire free, the copper ends sharp and rigid. He held the ends in his trembling, functional right hand. He had only one shot at this. If he pulsed the circuit too long, he would trip the emergency isolation breaker, cutting the power entirely. If he pulsed it too short, Rowan wouldn't see the signal buried beneath the static. He pressed the 2 wires together in a sharp, controlled spark. 1. He separated them, waited, and pressed them again. 2. He began to transmit the contamination frequency in short, measured bursts, counting the pulses internally, mapping the complex data structure onto the Krellin binary code he had memorized only hours before. Each pulse sent a searing jolt up his arm, amplified by the water and the proximity to the live circuit. He completed the first sequence, the biological signature identifier, and collapsed momentarily against the cold, damp wall, sweat mixing with the chemical residue on his skin. He felt the contamination accelerating. A profound, shivering cold now settled deep in his bones, defying the heat of the industrial ruins. Did she see it? The silence was heavy, only the rhythmic rush of the floodwaters filling the void. No reply, no confirmation. Rowan was either gone, or the signal was too weak. He forced himself to start the second sequence, the critical system collapse prediction, the data that would prove the consensus had leveraged the colony's death into a weapon. Just as he began the sequence, the terminal in front of him flickered violently, not a power surge, but a deliberate, hostile manipulation. A digitized voice, thin and highly compressed, hissed from the waterlogged speaker, overriding the emergency tone. Varric Stonehall. I read the pulse. It was not Rowan. It was Rourke, or a powerful directorate system acting on Rourke's behalf, having anticipated and tracked the attempted transmission through the sub-level utility lines. You have compromised directorate assets in excess of 700 million credits and committed aggravated assault against superior officers by environmental sabotage. You are ordered to power down that circuit and await extraction. Rourke's command center wasn't retreating. They were simply waiting for Varric to drown or surrender. Varric looked at the wires in his hand. If he stopped, Rourke would secure the area, clean the contamination silently, and frame Varric for the entire systemic failure, ensuring the Directorate maintained its political narrative. If he continued, Rourke would simply target the power junction, vaporizing Varric entirely. Varric ignored the digitized order. He completed the second pulse sequence, the electrical shock causing his vision to narrow to a pinpoint of red light. Then Rourke's voice changed, dropping the institutional facade, revealing the cold, strategic malice beneath. I know you lost the chip, Stonehall. I know you are contaminated. You are a biological liability. Finish your suicide, and we will list you as a fallen hero of the Krellin protection effort. Continue this futile technical rebellion, and I will erase every record of your existence. Your choice. Varric held the wires, the exposed copper ends touching. He had one final code packet to transmit. The Krellin algorithm needed to neutralize the bioagent. He had to send it to Rowan. He had to assume she was still out there, listening on the periphery. He looked around the flooded, ruined sector. He had fought a system designed to fail him, and he had won a devastating technical victory. But he had lost his life, his honor, and his evidence. He forced the final connection. A long, sustained pulse designed to overload the low-voltage circuit and burn the signal deep into the nearest capacitor banks. The resulting electrical surge didn't just shock him, it threw him backward, slamming his body against the concrete. The smell of burning plastic and ozone was overwhelming. The terminal died. The emergency strobes died. The sector plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Varric lay still, unable to move, unable to breathe. He felt the cold, systemic sickness of the bioagent spreading rapidly, turning his extremities numb. He had sent the final message. He had committed treason against the Human Interstellar Directorate. Then, 600 meters above the flooded sublevel, through the profound silence of the destroyed junction, Varric heard the faint, high-frequency chirp of a tertiary power relay activating and immediately powering down again. A ghost protocol, a confirmation. Rowan had the data. The victory was fleeting, useless, and utterly complete. Varric had exposed Rourke's lie, but at the cost of his body and his status as a human being. He forced his chin up, trying to pierce the darkness. He felt utterly alone, stranded between the crushing indifference of the consensus and the murderous pragmatism of the Directorate. He heard a new sound then, something heavy and rhythmic, but this time slow, careful, and not entirely human. Not the armored boots of Rourke's detail, which had retreated, but a subtle, mechanical scraping along the ruined primary egress shaft. It was too small to be a combat exoskeleton, too precise to be debris. It was a search drone, modified for environmental retrieval, and it was descending toward him, not with the aggressive intent of Rourke's team, but with the quiet, focused precision of a rescue operation. Varric tried to move, but his body refused. His vision swam. He was beyond saving. The drone stopped 20 feet away, its single eye scanning the wreckage. Varric saw the familiar markings on its chassis. Not Directorate standard issue, but a hybrid design, incorporating salvaged Krellin components. Then, a synthesized voice, calm and deep, echoed from the drone's speaker, a voice Varric recognized from the ruined assembly hall above. Varric Stonehall, the human who preferred a flood to a surrender. It was Elder Zoraz. "We received the anomaly, the biological contamination code. You provided the necessary defense data for the colony you were supposedly protecting for purely selfish reasons." The Krellin voice held no judgment, only factual observation. "Commander Rourke's command has sealed the upper levels. You are now classified as an internal failure. The Directorate has abandoned you." The drone extended a fine manipulator arm, carrying a small, sterile injection syringe. The Krellin people, however, do not abandon a liability that proves to be useful. Your knowledge is vital for the current political crisis. We require your survival, Stonehall. We offer you the first antidote dose. Varric, weakened and defeated, looked at the proffered syringe. He was no longer a Directorate technician, a rogue agent, or a hero. He was merely an asset being traded between two cynical powers, leveraging his dying breath for their respective survival. The Krellin, forgotten for 80 cycles, now held the power over his life. He reached out his trembling, contaminated hand towards the drone, knowing that accepting the antidote meant becoming entirely, absolutely beholden to the interests of the protected. He was exchanging one master for another, sealing his fate in the deep ruins of Verlasung Drei. He had escaped death, only to become the last, most valuable piece of human collateral in the galactic game. The antidote was cold, viscous, and immediately painful, not the blinding, searing shock of the chemical residue that coated his skin, but a deep intracellular agony, the sensation of alien medicine aggressively wrestling the contaminant into stasis. Varric felt the rapid, systemic cold abate, replaced by a profound, paralyzing exhaustion. He watched the robotic arm of the Krellin drone retract, the empty syringe clicking into a sterile housing. The darkness around him remained absolute, the rushing water below him the only constant sound in the sub-level grave. The first dose stabilizes, Zoraz's voice stated through the drone's speaker, calm and emotionless. The full cure requires proprietary genetic sequencing and long-term treatment, a procedure only available here, Stonehall, under our observation. Varric didn't respond. He simply leaned his head back against the damp concrete, accepting the weight of the chains Zoraz had just applied. Survival was not redemption. It was leverage. The drone engaged heavy magnetic clamps and slowly, methodically, began hauling Varric's broken body upward through the narrow secondary egress shaft. The journey was agonizing, a slow torture of strained muscle and torn ligaments, each meter marking his transition from human asset to alien property. He emerged not into a command center, but a sterile, underground medical bay far beneath the Krellin assembly hall. The light here was low, filtered, and yellow, not the harsh white of Directorate Standard issue. 2 Krellin technicians, dressed in high-grade environmental suits, moved with silent, practiced efficiency, stabilizing his shattered right shoulder and cleaning the bioagent residue from his skin. Varric was an exhibit of institutional failure. Rourke's command team had sealed the upper access points, declaring the structural collapse unstable and the lower sectors contaminated beyond recovery. Officially, engineering technician Varric Stonehall was listed in the preliminary reports as missing, presumed deceased, resulting from structural failure and unforeseen alien decay. The critical data, the evidence of the consensus's biological weapon, was scrubbed, replaced by politically palatable euphemisms. The only physical proof remaining was the faint chirp Rowan Ash had logged 600 meters above, a coded data pulse now buried deep in a Directorate tertiary archive, a ghost file she would have to fight Rourke to keep alive. 3 standard cycles later, Varric was still confined to the Krellin medical station. He was medically stable, though permanently scarred and operating with a mobility brace fixed to his shoulder. He was fed, treated, and entirely isolated. Elder Zoraz visited only once. He did not ask for gratitude or loyalty, only expertise. Your civilization, Stonehall, seeks to claim us by offering protection. They failed to account for the weapons left behind by the civilization that abandoned us, Zoraz observed, his tall, thin figure casting a long shadow in the filtered light. The bioagent is neutralized for the immediate threat, thanks to your transmission. But the core resonator, the main power source you attempted to disable, remains operational. We must now weaponize that power against your Directorate, should Rourke attempt to enforce his claim. Varric, sitting upright on the sterile cot, felt a grim acceptance. He had traded Rourke's reckless pursuit of political gain for Zoraz's cold, calculated survival. Both paths demanded the same sacrifice: his knowledge, his labor, and his silence. You need an analyst to calculate the energy distribution matrices, Varric croaked, his voice weak from disuse and contamination. The original power curve is unstable. Precisely, Zoraz affirmed. Your life is now tied to the stability of Verlassung Drei. You will teach my engineers how to control the weapon that was meant to kill us all. You will ensure that Rourke's protection is met with Krellin deterrence. Varric was led, not by guards, but by the quiet authority of necessity, into a small, windowless analysis station. It was austere. A metal desk, a single Krellin display, and the faint, acidic smell of plastic violently scorched by a surge of high voltage. The same scent that had filled his olfactory filters on the Krellin fusion array 3 cycles earlier. The signature of electrical systems pushed far past their operational limits. He was back where he started, a technician wrestling with decaying alien metallurgy and catastrophic power consumption metrics, only this time the consequences were civilizational, not merely political. He pulled up the schematics of the fusion array. The main housing fracture remained, a gaping, unrepaired wound. His dissenting report, the one he had filed in triplicate before sealing his helmet, warning that the metallurgy wouldn't hold the acceleration forces, was now a prophetic obituary. He ran his good hand, the one that had transmitted the desperate code, across the cold, rough metal of the console. The Directorate had won the initial narrative. The Krellin had won the immediate survival. Varric Stonehall was merely the cost of transfer, the contaminated currency used to pay the debt. He began the calculations, mapping the required power adjustments needed to turn the Krellin resonator from a generator into a strategic deterrent. His existence was now focused on ensuring the continuation of a proxy war waged through technical stability and lethal threat. He was no longer worried about Rourke's 48-hour timeline. He was worried about the long decay, the structural fatigue of the galaxy itself, which seemed perpetually destined to repeat the same failures. The political timelines are gone, replaced by the mathematical certainty of stress fracture. He was alive, but the world he fought to save, the ideal of a humane, principled intervention, that was the thing that truly died in the toxic flood, buried 600 meters deep. He leaned forward, activating the terminal. The price of protection is always higher than the cost of abandonment, and humanity pays its debts in corrupted souls. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.